Hello and welcome all to our presentation today. So any conversation about software is highly subjective, and that of open source versus proprietary software is no different. When companies and orgs are facing a redesign, the discussion on whether to adopt one or the other is often pivotal to the direction of that the project will take. Each software class has multiple pros and cons, besides other dependencies like extensibility that can make one ideal for some projects and not for others. As a project owner, the biggest challenge you will face when deciding which to pick is sifting through these details and zeroing in on the mission critical features required. This webinar provides a simplified yet helpful exposition of the open source versus proprietary software debate to make it easier and faster for you to decide which one will work best for your project. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. We'll do some host introductions, and we'll get into our presentation. We'll cover some questions and answers and conclude with a special offer. So let's get started. So my name is Corey Dockin. I am the VP of Digital Strategy at 08, and I'll be the host here today. And with us is Seth Vibrock. Seth, do you want to give a little intro?
Yeah, I'm founder and CEO of a long history in the Drupal community and in general being involved in open source software and programming languages for many years.
Thank you, Seth. And also with us is Andy Keith. Andy, want to give a quick intro?
Sure. Hi, I'm Andy Keith. I'm, as you can see, VP of Strategy and Analytics. Been with 08 for about 5 years and touch on a lot of different areas of our service offerings, including working with developers in Drupal and WordPress, and then integrating various other platforms, Google Analytics, HubSpot, and other supporting marketing measurement and automation platforms.
All right, thanks, guys. All right, so next, a few housekeeping items. Enter questions into the question panel. You can do that throughout the presentation here. Questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Make sure you are on mute during the webinar, and we will provide a recording of this after. So yeah, let's get into it. So let's start with just the pure basics here. And I'm gonna point this one to you, Seth. So for those that don't know out there, what exactly is a CMS?
CMS is a content management system. Some people think of Drupal or some of these other large scale ones as a content management framework, very extensible. You can build many different things with them, but essentially it's just a platform for housing and editing, creating, distributing content, most notably as a website.
All right, and so there's a lot of different kinds out there, and then today's talk is around open source versus proprietary. So what is the difference between those two?
Well, open source is when you can look into the code that creates the platform or the website, but also that you can modify it. And generally there's a notion of community behind it, that this is not created by one single entity, not all the time. Sometimes an enterprise will open source their proprietary software. It's no longer proprietary, but generally there's some sort of community where you can contribute to the code base of the platform. Whereas proprietary, generally you can't see the code, that's locked down. You don't have visibility into how it runs, and you certainly can't contribute to it as an outside member.
Got it. So let's dig into the benefits of each types. What are some of the kind of pros and cons here of open source?
Well, like I said, you can easily or freely try it, use it, modify it, redistribute it. You've got this community behind it, which helps not only vet the utility of the platform and increase its effectiveness, but also it's a security, it's a security measure too. The more eyeballs you have on code base, the more likely you're going to get someone who points out a bug or whatnot. So there's just lots of code level and security level benefits. You also have open standards, that increase transparency, faster fixes, fewer bugs. You can see them all here. You don't have the vendor lock-in. So for example, you go to a big company like Oracle and they have a proprietary CMS, then you're locked in, right? You have to pay their vendor fees every year. They can increase their prices at any time, right? So that's one big thing. Whereas open source, you get it for free. Essentially, you might have to pay for some plugins here and there, but generally those are low priced. They're monthly or a one and done fee that is much more predictable. No IP restrictions, simple license management, they scaled and extended.
And how about if we're talking about proprietary software? What are some of the pros and cons to consider with proprietary?
Yeah, proprietary, well, let's think of pros. I guess the pros are if you really trust or have a solid relationship with the company, maybe you're familiar with their developers or their in-house team, or they have a really great security track record. They've been around a really long time, and you can just kind of trust that they're not going to make mistakes in the future, that they're not going to have a dev team that is degraded or gets less effective over time. But I'm having a little bit trouble finding pros of proprietary over open source. I guess if the open source, contrasting individual projects, if the open source project itself is not well supported, of course, then you don't want to buy into or start using something that is not well maintained, that doesn't have the community behind it. For example, in that instance, if there's not a viable open source alternative, then proprietary makes more sense, right? But otherwise, a well-maintained, highly supported open source project tends to offer more benefits in terms of cost, security, all that, than proprietary. I will say, sometimes the level of support from an open source community might not give you a certain level of user experience. We work with HubSpot, for example, which is a marketing platform, and it's just so complex and ever changing that there just hasn't, we haven't seen a marketing platform out there that has surfaced to rival HubSpot in terms of usability, user experience, ongoing growing feature set, so that's one example where proprietary just makes more sense. It's just the open source community can't deliver or hasn't delivered a solution that's as usable, as current, as complex.
I'll just tag on to that to say that in open source, one of the benefits of it is that it is, in fact, can go in a lot of different directions. Any number of people who want to contribute to it, anybody from the community can jump in and create, help shape the overall development of the open source platform. And that can be really good, but it also can get somewhat unruly to some degree. You get a little bit, it's very, very democratic, but then you potentially also have some chaos around the edges of that, potentially. With a proprietary platform, if it's solid, if it's built on a really good code base, you typically have a development team, you've got a history, you've got a vision behind it. To some degree, the fact that it is narrower, that it is limited, that you don't have everybody jumping in and you don't have a lot of cooks in the kitchen can mean that can be engineered to be a little bit more straightforward, feel a little bit more polished. Again, that's highly subjective. There's some very polished open source software. I mean, WordPress being an example of that as well, you know, and for that matter, Drupal as well. But the example of HubSpot is really apt. It is very user friendly, feature rich, extensible in some ways, but it is not an open source platform. You can't just invite everybody into the party and start messing with it. On the other hand, HubSpot then gets to control the overall direction and evolution of the platform, hopefully to the benefit of its users. So you're trading freedom for a certain amount of maybe creative oversight by the people who develop the software. And that can work to your advantage, but it can also work to your detriment.
So you mentioned WordPress and Drupal as those are the two most popular open source platforms. What are some examples of proprietary CMSs that are out there?
Yeah, there's there's Sitecore, there's Kentico, there's Adobe had Expression Engine. I forget what the latest name of the platform is these days, but there's tons of them. There's just tons and tons and tons of them, and you'll get into situations. Okay, Adobe, for example, that's going to be well supported. You're going to have a developer community that knows how to work in that platform, for example, so that you don't have to hire someone from Adobe, but rather a developer who knows, who works, for themselves or an agency or whatever, who knows how to work for that platform. But since there are so many, you'll get these really specific, like random CMS for higher education, and you'll almost have to pay the company and their developers because there's no other developers that know how to work in that platform. Or the developers that you do hire will have a long learning experience to get ramped up and familiar with the platform or the language that they use. Sometimes they'll use esoteric languages where programming languages that just aren't common today. So you have to think about who is going to be supporting this thing and what's their on-ramping time to support it, and things like this.
Yep. So it's almost like a SaaS that you're licensing. Would that be a correct way to describe it?
Yeah, it is much more. It's similar to SaaS. Ideally, these things are more extensible than a typical SaaS platform. They'll give you an API, or you can code in, templates. Adjust the templates so that you can make your website more your own. But yeah, the customizability and extensibility does vary among these platforms. It's really a mixed bag. Yeah, you get CMS as a service, and then sometimes it's really hard to make things look and act like you want if it's a proprietary platform.
I got it. So here's another discussion point. What would you say to someone who says you get what you pay for when they choose open source? And I'm going to aim for Seth.
I would say that's not correct. There's a whole community that is contributing for this solution in open source, and often it's companies like us or larger corporations that are contributing. Sometimes the government, often the government, for example, uses Drupal, so they will be contributing to the platform, creating these modules or plugins that enhance the functionality. So it's not like you are paying for this platform. This whole community is paying for this platform to make it really great, right? So that one-to-one relationship, you get what you pay for, just doesn't make sense in this particular analogy.
I mean, to some degree, it really is like completely different mindsets. If you're buying into proprietary tool, it's essentially a transaction. You're saying, I need to hire this software to do X for me, and it better do all these things. And here's the feature list, and this is what I want. And as long as the company continues to deliver on that, then I'm basically happy, and I'm just going to go about my business. if you decide that you're going to go the open source route, you are hopefully going because have you have an admiration or it resonates that what that community is doing is of value, and you want to be part of it, you want to contribute to that. So it's a completely different mindset. It's much more of a communitarian, collaborative mindset than the sort of typical I'm buying the X product to do Y. You're buying into a platform that you yourself, you may or may not contribute to it, but the expectation is that if you needed to change things or you needed it to do a certain something, that there's a lot of, you can start searching through extensive databases of plugins and modules and probably find something. And if it's not exactly what you want, you can probably then modify it. That's a whole different mindset than proprietary. So to some degree, you're getting in both cases what you paid for. One is a transaction, but the other is buying into a community and a certain philosophy of site development, tool development.
Yeah, I think that's really important to highlight. You're part of something bigger when you choose open source. These platforms or tools that are open source might be supporting a government in a developing country or a nonprofit, or allowing someone with a lower budget to do much more in the world. So there are lots of benevolent things that come from open source, and so it's good to do good in the world, right? You're part of something bigger when you choose open source.
How about this? Do small and medium-sized businesses use open source? We mentioned some of these big, proprietary platforms. I'm assuming they're used by larger companies, and is open source generally used by the small and medium-sized businesses?
I would say it's used by all types of businesses, and small and medium, yeah, for sure. WordPress, for example, it's used by individual people, just because it's such a low barrier to entry. But you also have major news sites running on WordPress, or so I don't think it's as much of a, well, I guess you will get a bias in the enterprise, that's maybe from older thinking, that proprietary is better, or something like that. But I see it used across small, medium, large enterprise businesses, governments. It's used across all scales of businesses.
Right. And I mean, when you say businesses, I mean, and it's not just websites either. I mean, Tesla to some degree makes its source code available,
Yeah.
partly because you want those people, you want eyes on it. And this sort of segues into security. And we're going to be talking a little bit about this next, but it's this idea that when you've got thousands of eyes who on the software and they know how it operates, then you have people who are ready to fix things and jump in and create patches and create security fixes. And to some degree, this is why you see large educational sites, you see government sites, organizations like NASA that are using, say, Drupal for their site development, because the security is so much better. And we're going to get into that in a bit, but again, even for a smaller organization, if security is really important, then they're going to probably gravitate towards a platform like Drupal, just because there's so many skilled people who can, something happens that needs to be addressed, people can immediately jump on it. And there's a lot of people who know what's going on with that platform.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I kind of advanced this slide a little fast there, but but I hear this from the clients I talk to, is that they have concerns around security. So what how can we approach security when we're talking about open source?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a misnomer to think that open source makes something inherently less secure. Open source projects in general, everything, back in the day, from the Linux and Unix operating systems, have attracted some of the world's best, most elite programmers, because they tend to be attracted to this ability to collaborate and work on really smart, really elegant solutions, which then you go over to the enterprise side, and you don't get often these really beautiful, elaborately done solutions when you actually look at the internals of the code. Open source is, you know, a pure, open, ever improving, you know, transparent thing that just gets better and better if you've got a community behind it. For everything from the way they test it to the way they review security to way they code functions to make things secure, you know, whereas you get into a corporate situation that's focused on profit and not the purity of the code and not the purity of the collaboration and the community and the systems in place to make the code beautiful. You know, you get very messy things that you'll see in the news. These corporations that have some system or whatever it is that gets hacked. That and of course, you know, that happens to some degree with open source, but you know, it's this culture of profit versus the beauty of the code that that can make the difference, and the fact that in open source, you know, not all projects, but when you get into a big project like Drupal, they have a dedicated security team that is reviewing the code, that has automated ways of testing the code and ensuring its integrity. And then you also have more eyes on the code, right, from the community. You get 10 guys working in some enterprise project supporting it, you know, they're maybe not looking at the security, you know, they're, and it's definitely not as many eyes, and probably, you know, like I said, the talent is maybe less elite. They're people who are just happy to get paid and, you know, do some dev work. But on the open source end, you've got this community of really elite, smart folks reviewing everything. So that's a big difference, I think.
And also folks who are super passionate about it and
Yeah.
really identify with that platform. So if something goes wrong on the platform or something needs to be addressed, there's really a rallying effect where people are going to immediately jump on this, and they're going to jump on this not because they're afraid that they're if they don't get this fixed, they're going to get fired or the company's going to get a black eye. It's more just that there's just an underlying feeling that if the integrity of the platform is compromised, that's bad for everybody. So there is this communitarian principle where everybody rallies to fix that, and therefore you see these holes get addressed very quickly.
Yeah. And to be honest, you know, about WordPress, for example, you've maybe heard in the news or seen examples of WordPress sites getting hacked, but really that's because the site owners generally are not keeping their code up to date. One thing about open source is you need to keep up to date because the community is releasing, you know, fines and releases security fixes. So, you know, just like anything, if you don't maintain it, proprietary or not, you're very likely to open yourself up to security issues, security flaws that can lead to your site getting hacked. Same thing if you use some random guy's WordPress module that has very few views or uses or installations and just hasn't been reviewed. If you don't do your own internal code review, you know, just like you would with if you're a developer at an enterprise situation, you know, you can open yourself up to threats. So really good security hygiene, staying up to date, you can be just as secure, if not more secure, in open source.
So, you know, we know that open source is free and proprietary has licensing costs. However, is open source going to be free forever? Can we put people's minds at ease about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's of course always a chance that some corporation would buy a project and turn it from open source to closed sourced, or modify the user agreement in some way or the legal rights of usage. But if that's why you got to look at the community and the strength of community. For example, like WordPress is not going away, Drupal's not going away. But, in the course of decades or many years, it is possible that certain platforms will fade, but that's just like anything. You get entire corporations, their products fade and come out of favor because they have a lot of technical debt or whatever. Just people jump on to the next trend. So, but I would say it's more reliable that an open source project would stay free and maintained if it has a good community support, from now into the future.
And then I think you mentioned
This
earlier
sort
are
of,
plugins that have licensing fees though, right? Like third-party plugins that you may have to pay for.
I see. Yeah, that's, especially with WordPress as an example, they do have some plugins that you pay for, but with that, you're fixing one of the difficult things sometimes about open source. You're paying a programmer essentially to own and maintain this project, giving them a financial incentive. Whereas, sometimes in other projects, you just will get a developer that has a life or that can just update or whatever it is, if it's a more obscure module that's not as used by the entire community. So it's just fixing a little bit of an inefficiency in the open source ecosystem. And I think it totally makes sense to pay $30 or $40, for a plugin. Or sometimes even $100 if it's very complex and comprehensive, and that's compared to thousands and thousands of dollars per year, month, whatever, on these proprietary systems. So I really don't think it's much of a big deal for the situations we're talking about here. And then generally there's a free equivalent if you don't want to pay.
Andy, did you want to add to that?
no, I think that's fine. I think
Okay.
well made.
So how about this? What is more customizable? Would it be open source or proprietary?
I would say open source in general tends to be much more customizable, right? Like the code is out there. That generally means you have a lot of freedom to customize, and it's built in that mindset. Anything that's open source is generally built in a mindset that, hey, there's this whole community of people that want to use this thing. Let's make sure as much as possible is customizable. That's not to say that proprietary systems aren't customizable, but generally not to the same degree. You don't want to be in there modifying the core of Drupal or WordPress, because then that breaks things. You've got this core in both systems that stays the same and gets upgraded with security fixes, but everything else outside of the core, you can customize. And that's not always true with proprietary, and much less often, I would say.
With proprietary systems, software, you think about it, there's lots of things around the edges that they will make, quasi open, or they'll provide an application programming interface and an API, so you get data in and out. And you can have third-party programs interact with the software in some way. HubSpot has got thousands of such integrations. So that's how you typically can start with a proprietary platform, maintain control over its user interface and over its just the look and feel of it, but at the same time allow other programs and other software bases to interact with it. But when you get to open source, you can get much further in. You can really get your hands inside the code and bend it to your will and make things make things work the way you think that they should work. So and the point I was also just previously was going to make about the way that open source and commercial software is, occasionally you will see an open source platform that goes commercial, but it doesn't go completely commercial. I mean, Red Hat Linux being an example where you'll take a version and then you'll market that in some way. And then of course, in open source, people do build whole businesses around creating plugins, creating modules, charging for that. So, but again, it's just this idea that it's a mindset that you're buying into. In one case, you're saying, I'm part of a community and we own, this is this is common ground that we all stand on and we all own it and interact with it, versus proprietary. It's behind a wall someplace, and I might be given access points in that wall where I can reach in and I can make some changes, or I can get my program or my code base to talk to that proprietary code base. But it's just very locked down. So to some degree, it's what's your company's culture, what makes you more comfortable. You are definitely going to be much more readily able to customize the code if you're starting with an open source platform than the other way around. That's practically just encompassed in the definition of the terms.
What about integrating with other tools like a CRM or marketing automation? Can we do that with open source?
Absolutely. Again, it's open source is made with the mindset of lots of people, but also lots of systems want to integrate with this, or we want this to integrate with as many other platforms, systems as possible. Whereas proprietary, of course, you'll see situations where they have their integrations page and they integrate with this and that, but then the integration might break and then they stop supporting it, and you're just left with contacting them or their support team and hope that they restore it. Whereas in open source, you have control. If this third-party service or app or whatever it is, if the integration breaks, you can fix it. You can pay a developer to fix it. So you have much more control of your integrations, and you're not reliant on a third party like you would be for a proprietary system.
And then let's just circle back on this idea of contributions to the open source community. I mean, what does that entail?
It's communities do it in different ways, but generally you find a fix or a bug or a feature that you want to give back to the community. So basically you package up the code and either submit it as a patch to an existing project or to a core framework like Drupal or WordPress. And then someone from the community tests that fix or patch or module, and then commits it to the code base, the larger code base, however it's stored. And then that becomes available for other people to use, right? So it's basically code, throw it up on the web, get it tested, get it approved, and then it becomes available for other people. That makes sense.
So like with Drupal, there's thousands of developers out there improving it and adding to the platform on a daily basis, basically.
Yep. And not only the platform, but there's conferences, that support and distribute knowledge about the platform. So contribution isn't always code in open source. Sometimes it's organizing an event. And that's true for many other, I used to work in Perl, we organized Perl conferences. So, and then there's documentation, there's quality assurance of these patches or whatever that someone submits. There's lots of ways to get involved. There's training, all that stuff is considered contribution in the open source community.
So any final recommendations, you guys, on this topic? If someone is out there, they have a redesign coming up and they're thinking about open source versus proprietary.
I would say definitely consider open source and think about your values as a company. Try to dispel the myths of open source. If you have these negative connotations that just aren't true, and do your research. Look at the community contributions. Look at the developer community. Who's going to be supporting this thing. Think about whether it's future proof or not. If this is a whiz bang company that does a eccentric proprietary CMS, are they going to be in business 5 years from now? Are they going to be up on the latest trends compared with an open source community that's constantly evolving and staying up with the latest trends, for example? So don't get sold. Don't buy into sales pitches. A lot of the proprietary systems are really great at selling, and there's, obviously in open source you don't have that, right? Or you maybe have an agency that's promoting this or that, but why are they promoting this proprietary system? What financial incentive do they have to sell you this system? Are they truly taking your best interests in mind? Consider these things. Don't necessarily get sold into a system. Think about it logically and carefully.
There's a cost benefit analysis that pretty much anyone who's considering these platforms is going to look at. You're a small company, you don't have a technical staff, they don't have a lot of experience in open source. You have a simple website or you have a simple application. You don't think that it needs to get very extensive. You might feel very comfortable buying something off the shelf. You need to go and build an e-commerce site, and using a platform, for example, like Shopify is probably the way that you're going to go. A lot of people use it. It's got a lot of support. It's considered to be good quality. It's not going to be as extensible as something that you could do in open source. If you had a group of an IT department or a group of developers within your company, on the other hand, that is used to getting in and really understanding the nuts and bolts of the software and having control over it and being able to implement fixes at a moment's notice, then you're going to probably gravitate more towards that. So some of that is going to be dictated by the simplicity versus complexity of the solution, and some of it's going to be dictated by your own company's culture. If you have the type of people and you have the type of mindset that would naturally gravitate towards open source, then you're probably going to go in that direction. And if you are sitting there scratching your head saying, sounds really good, but I don't even know where would I even start, and how do I get into the community and so forth, that may not be the best configuration, or you may not be properly staffed or resourced for open source. It may be that you need to work on your dev team and your IT department, your company's culture first before you take that plunge. And then so you opt for something that is more restrictive and more controlled, but then potentially more conventional and off the shelf. Again, cost benefit analysis is going to really drive that.
Yeah. Great point.
Okay, let's move to some questions here. So this one is for Seth. I think you've kind of already stated this. It was as a former developer, which do you prefer and why? But I think you've kind of covered that in your previous slide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like I said, developers tend to prefer open source because of the beauty of the community and the ecosystem and the code and the challenge of collaborating with others and making something great.
How about this one? And this one's going to Andy. If someone wanted to disengage from a proprietary system and move to open source, what do you recommend?
Well, I'd start by recommending that you have a plan. Unless for whatever reason you're perfectly comfortable with just saying, the data I currently have, everything that I'm currently doing on this proprietary platform isn't going to matter, and I can essentially burn it all down and start over, and I'm just going to implement something completely from scratch. Hardly ever are you in that position. So then you really do need to build a migration plan. You have to think about what data is encompassed by this proprietary system, where and how is it being stored, how are you going to extract or export that data, how is it going to be removed from the system, and then what is the transfer format, and there's a number, XML being one, or CSV files and so forth. How are you going to migrate that database over to the open source platform? And when you do, what form is it going to take? How is that going to then be contained in various types of objects or pages, or how is it going to be presented? So it's not something that you just decide, hey, I think we're going to do this one day, unless again you're just starting completely from scratch, and you're going to want to think about, what's my goal here, what do I want to end up with, and then you're going to methodically think through the roadmap for how you're going to slowly and methodically pull that data out and not, not make that final cut until you're comfortable that the open source platform is up and stable and that your data plays well in it, and then you can finally disengage from the previous system. So as always, have a plan, measure twice and cut once, measure multiple times and cut once for something like this. These proprietary systems are not necessarily always happy to let go of that data. They don't want to see their users go. They often build in gotchas and traps. So evaluating that up front gives you an idea of how much pain you're going to go through in order to disengage from that type of platform.
So here's another one. If the marketing team wants to move to open source, but IT is locked into Sitecore or something, any advice to marketers trying to convince IT? Seth, do you want to try that one?
Sure. I would say, if you can, if you can, start with a prototype, start with the smallest MVP or prototype, what have you, and just play around with it, and then give that maybe to IT, maybe talk to an agency who is familiar with that open source platform and can help you have a more technical conversation with your IT team. And I guess maybe do your research, come up with their pain points, their issues with it. Often it tends to be a sense of control that IT thinks that they have over your website or over the hosting platform, whatever it is, that is actually a misplaced fear, right? So it's generally a conversation, an example, just any other way you can think of allaying the IT team's fears that are generally unfounded.
It's generally not going to be the case that you're going to march into IT and somehow make this really stirring speech and get them to completely abandon the proprietary platform that they've just invested lots of sunk cost and they have expertise built around that, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's not realistic to think that's going to happen. It could be an outcome down the road once they see the benefits of what you're doing. So the idea of find a piece of something that you can own, essentially a microcosm. Sometimes it's a win-win. Sometimes you realize that they do need to control their whole infrastructure. They've got it built up that way. But at the same time, as a marketer, you have a microsite or you have some other type of entity that you just want, you get essentially leave to go build this on WordPress, for example. And you create this blog or you create this site, e-commerce site or whatever, because the main infrastructure doesn't do all the things that the open source platform is going to easily enable you to do. And so to some degree, you don't have to really ask IT to change its whole setup. You just have to get their blessing to strike out in your own direction and build your own base. And then once you make that base successful, you can start to do more and more projects, essentially build your own ecosystem around that new open source microcosm of that entity. At a certain point, you are operating within that microcosm with a lot of autonomy, and then it may not be an issue anymore. IT can pretty much go its own way and do the things that it needs to do using the tools and platforms and environments that it needs, and they need to be adversarial. And they may be looking over your shoulder and saying, wow, that's amazing. You can do all this stuff. This would be a lot harder with, if we were trying to do it here, we wouldn't be able to support that. So it's great that you can support yourself. It can end up being a win-win, and eventually they may come over, and when it's time to evaluate the evolution of their platform and new licensing agreement, at that point, the center of gravity could potentially shift to the base that you've created in open source. So in part, it can be you can potentially live in harmony, even if it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game.
Yeah, and I would just add that if you focus on the long-term cost of ownership of your platform, sometimes often these proprietary systems are tens of thousands of dollars per year, depending on your system and your scale. And if you can make the business case and maybe show a little example, a little progress of this free open source platform that can do the same things, you might be able to get higher level business stakeholder involved in the conversation that's like, that tells IT to have a seat, because the long-term cost of ownership is going to be much less on this open source platform.
Well, those are all the questions we have or have time for. I just want to say, if anyone has any other questions, this is our agency-wide email right here. Feel free to email us at contact@08.agency. We also have a chat bot on our website. You can interact with us there and ask us questions. There's also a link here to further reading. So this topic that we've discussed today, we've documented on our blog. So check that out. And, thank you for watching. This has been great. Thank you, Seth and Andy, and we'll see you at our next webinar.